Welcome to She is Resilient, a podcast for women on their healing journeys who are ready to start living their most authentic and empowered lives outside of survival mode. I'm your host, Tatiana, trauma and somatic therapist, as well as a holistic coach, and I'm on a mission to help more women heal their nervous systems. Each week, me and my guests are going to get real and vulnerable about the experiences that led us to becoming the empowered and resilient women we are today. You'll leave this podcast with the skills, knowledge, and inspiration to start creating the life you deserve. Because if another woman can do it, so can you. Welcome back to another episode of She is Resilient. Today on the podcast, I have a guest who's going to be talking about her healing journey after leaving a toxic and abusive relationship. And so I want to put out a trigger warning. If you have ever been in a toxic or abusive relationship, I want you to be mindful of your body and notice if you start to become activated while listening to this episode. If you feel like it's too much for your body or your nervous system to handle, I want you to just take a pause from listening, come back to the episode when you're ready, come back to your body, come back to your breath, maybe orient yourself to the space around you, maybe practice some VU sounds. Settle your nervous system because there will potentially be some things that are said in the episode that can be triggering for someone, especially if you have been in an abusive relationship. So I just want to invite you to be aware of how your body responds while listening. So when you're ready, let's dive into the show. Welcome back to another episode of She is Resilient. Today on the podcast, we have Lianne. Lianne, do you want to introduce yourself, tell the audience who you are and what you do for a living?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Lianne. I'm the creator and host of the Us Thrive podcast. I'm also a relationship coach. I'm a speaker. I'm an advocate, and I'm a survivor of domestic violence. And I like to say on my own show that I'm just really trying to, well, I'm not trying. I am changing the world one conversation at a time. And I just really like to have raw, real, honest conversations about people who have gone through some things and what they've been able to turn that pain into. I'm all about turning your pain into power, your trauma into your triumph, and really showing people that despite the really ugly things that you've gone through in life, you can turn that around. And now that's what I'm doing with my own story and my own experience.
I love that so much, and thank you so much for being here to tell your story. So let's dive in a little bit. I'll invite you to just share a little bit more about your healing journey and what led you to become this current version of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I have no problem sharing. I get very open on my own podcast and I like to share the truth with people because when it comes to being in abusive relationships, there's such a stigma, there's such a taboo behind it that it's normalized to be silenced and it's normal for especially us women to not talk about it. And I know that I survived what I went through for a reason. So as uncomfortable as it may make someone feel, you need to know the truth because I know I'm not the only one who has gone through what I went through. And I've realized that after coming out of that abusive relationship. So I was in an abusive relationship during the pandemic back in 2020. Of course, in the beginning, I'm sure you can attest that like it's rainbows and butterflies when you first meet that person. I thought finally it was my turn. This was my third serious relationship. And before that, I just had a really long history of dealing with really shitty people. Am I allowed to curse on this podcast?
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. I dealt with a lot of shitty people. And what I realized after leaving that last relationship that I was stuck in a cycle of just repeating the same pattern, but having a different body in place. Like I was meeting the same type of man, just in a different form. And in the beginning, like I said, it was rainbows and butterflies. I felt like, oh my God, I found my Prince Charming. I finally found the one. But what I've come to realize is he was pretending to be someone that he wasn't, and he could only put on that mask or that facade for so long. And it got to the point, it was a very short-lived relationship. I was only with him for 10 months, but it got to the point that eventually it became physically abusive and he almost killed me. And going through that relationship and almost losing my life, I didn't realize it back then, but that was when my purpose was born. That night that he almost killed me and I was able to escape from my apartment was when I realized that I went through this and I survived through it for a reason. And on my healing, I'm sure we're going to get into that a little bit, but I was able to start my podcast and talk about that experience and other things that I've gone through. And I always tell myself that I know I survived what I went through for a reason. And this is the reason right here, me sitting down and having this conversation with you. But yeah, it took for me to almost lose my life in order for me to really appreciate it and really start to do that inner work that I didn't do for my entire life in order for me to grow from that relationship and really grow into the woman that I am today.
Oh my gosh. So, first of all, I just want to commend you for having the courage to share your experience and talk about this topic, because I know it takes a lot of courage to speak up on this, and it's not a topic that is talked about enough. And I don't think that anyone deserves to go through any of this. And I really appreciate you being so vulnerable with us and being able to share, again, your story and your experience with us. And I'm also curious to know, what was that like for you internally in that moment? What was that experience like for you?
I remember what it got really violent. Trigger warning, I want to put that out now. There was a lot of horrible things that he did to me that night. He threatened to kill me multiple times. He strangled me multiple times. He put a knife to my neck. Like the things that you see on movies, that was my lived experience. And I remember just praying to God over and over and over in my mind, God, please let me get out of this apartment. Let me make it out of here alive, because I truly thought that I was going to die. I really thought that that was going to be the end for me. And it was a terrifying feeling. I never felt that kind of fear before in my life, but I just kept praying over and over and over. I kept saying, I have a daughter. I kept telling him, I have a daughter. Please, please just let me go. Let me go. And I know that God was with me. I had angels with me. I know there was something bigger than me that was with me that night, that when I found the opportunity to run, that's exactly what I did. When he had his back towards me and I listened to that intuition that was telling me, if you don't get out right now, you're not going to make it out, I decided to leave. And I ran out of my apartment. I'll never forget. It was like 1 o'clock in the morning. All I have is a robe on. I don't have my shoes. I don't have my phone. I don't have a wallet. I have nothing. And I literally just ran for my life. And I was able to really save my life because I decided to listen to that voice that honestly I realized was definitely there throughout the entire relationship. I know we talked about on my podcast about that inner knowing, that female intuition that we all have, but I ignored it throughout the entire relationship, and it was screaming at me that night to listen to it, and that's what really saved me from the most horrible experience I ever went through in my life.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And, I think about how hard it is to truly listen to your intuition and that inner knowing in those moments, especially when your nervous system doesn't have the capacity for it. Like, I think about all of the women who are in abusive relationships and can't leave that relationship. And it's not because they don't want to, but it comes down to how much capacity your nervous system has. And when your nervous system doesn't have the capacity to fight or to flee, then we freeze, right? And we continue to stay in that relationship. And I think about how much resiliency and capacity your nervous system had in that moment. And I know that sometimes the word resiliency gets a bad rep, right? Because sometimes people think like, oh, resilient, I don't want to be resilient, I don't want to be strong, right? But I think about resiliency in the capacity that your nervous system actually has, right? And in that moment, you did have the resiliency in your nervous system because you had that capacity to leave, to take action. When we can't take action, it's not because you're not strong, it's because your nervous system just doesn't have the capacity, and so we freeze, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I knew something told me in that moment, it's either you're going to run or you're going to die.
Yeah.
And that it took for me to have that, I like to call it like my come to Jesus moment, for
Mhm.
me to really wake up and be like, this needs to happen right now. There is no time to think, there is no time to plan. Even though I knew for months before, like, I did not want to be in this relationship anymore, but I chose to stay because I didn't want to be alone, because I love this person so much that I felt like I could change him. But I mean, me and you both know with our lived experience, that person, the only person that you can change is yourself, right? And it really took for me to almost lose my life to really appreciate that and be like, I got to put me first for once in my life. Like, I matter that much. And that's what really started the healing for me.
Yeah, and tell us about that healing journey. After you left that relationship, what happened next?
Yeah. So no one knew that I was in an abusive relationship. And I like to share that because that's something that I hear often with other survivors that I interview on my own show. There's such a shame, there's such an embarrassment when you're in these types of relationships, because you never think that this person that you're so in love with, that you're spending all your time with, that you have all these dreams and you talk about planning a future and all of that, that they're really going to turn out to be a monster, right? So no one knew what I was going through, but what I portrayed on social media was like, this is the best person in the world. So when everything happened, I went to my best friend's apartment. Shout out to Giovanna. I always love to give her her flowers because she truly saved me that night, leaning on that support system that I didn't even realize that I had, because I was so isolated when I was in that relationship. I remember me and my family, we weren't really speaking anymore because they didn't like him, even though they never met him. They just knew something was not right with him. My friends didn't know what was going on until that night that everything went down. And I showed up at her apartment at like 2 o'clock in the morning, banging on her door like I'm the police. She opens up and she sees me and she can tell that I've been through some shit. And I would never forget, 12 hours prior, that night that everything happened, I spent the day with her telling her that I'm so sick of him. He's been cheating on me throughout the entire relationship. He's treating me like shit, but she didn't know that, there was physical abuse going on. But I had told her, like, tonight when I get home, I'm going to break up with him. Like, that's it. And then when I showed up at her apartment, that was when I said out loud, he's trying to kill me. I need your help. And it's because of her that I called 911. It's because of her that he did end up serving time in prison. He just got out recently, but he did spend 4 years in prison for what he did to me. So I was able to get some sort of justice. And it's because I spoke up and I told someone what was going on that I was able to start healing from that trauma. And I realized that I couldn't heal from that on my own. And I really needed to lean on my support system. I flew back home. My shout out to my sister. She booked me a one-way ticket back home. I was living in Florida when that happened. Moved my apartment out for me, broke my lease, sent all my things back home, and just allowed me to just be still and allowed me to just really, you know, deal with the aftermath of going through something so traumatic. And that's really what started, is just me speaking up and talking about what happened, and then leaning on that support system and knowing that I did not need to start healing from that by myself.
I love that you had that strong support system. And I'm also curious if you decided to start therapy right away or if you tried some other healing modalities first.
Girl, yes.
Yes.
Like I said, this was a trauma that I was not prepared for. It's nothing, it's something that I never experienced growing up. I didn't grow up in an abusive home. I didn't know anyone in my personal life who dealt with something like that. So I was very naive to that whole experience. And I knew when I came back home, like, I have a lot of shit that I got to work on. Like this almost took me out, right? So the first thing that I ever did, shout out to my mom too, because I'm telling you, when everything happened that night, like I lost everything. Lost my apartment, I lost my job 2 weeks before. My car broke down, it wasn't working. I was furloughed from my job and that ran out. So I had no money coming in. Like literally, I was broken down to nothing. But being on the other side of healing now, I appreciate that because I was able to start from zero. And I feel like that's what I really needed. I really needed to rebuild myself. I think of like the phoenix rising from the ashes. I had to really start from nothing in order for me to become the woman that I am today. But the very first thing that I ever did was working with a life coach and going to therapy. I did individual talk therapy and I did group therapy. And that for me was so life changing because I was able to really accept what happened to me and talk about it in a safe space, that I wasn't judged, that I wasn't shamed, that I wasn't embarrassed to talk about it, and then really start to learn what was it about me that I had to take accountability and responsibility when it comes to staying in those types of relationships. I worked with several life coaches. Therapy worked so good for me. And, just leaning on that support. And then my podcast too. Eventually, after I was, like in my cocoon, I was really just focused on healing my inner self. I decided to start talking publicly about what I gone through, and that was really the birth of my podcast. And once I put it out there into the universe, it blew my mind how so many people were able to relate to my experience and to know that I was not alone with what I'd gone through. That for me was the most healing aspect for me. I think there's such a power in storytelling. That's why I love the podcast that we have, just the communities that we're building, to know that, like, yo, we're not suffering through this by ourselves. Even though when we're going through it, we feel so fucking alone, right? But when you come together as a collective and you talk about what you've gone through and you can share those stories, that right there is so healing. That's what I've been doing ever since.
Uh, I'm so curious to know what the process of making your story public was like for you, because I'll be honest with you, when I first found out about your podcast, and I actually found out about your podcast before we even connected,
Mm,
and because you had a guest who we have a mutual guest,
mhm.
and she was on your podcast, and I remember her sharing your podcast, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. I would like to be on her podcast, but there was this fear of like, I don't know if I want my story to be out there like that. I've never talked about my domestic abuse. I've never talked about my toxic relationship, even on this podcast. I haven't talked about it. But one of my fears was really about him. And
Mhm.
like, what if he ever came across this podcast, and what would that be like? Am I going to be in danger? Am I going to be unsafe? And so I'm curious to know what that was like for you, and maybe if there were steps if there were things that you had to put into place so that that wouldn't happen.
Yeah. I know for me, I definitely had a sense of safety when I first started it because I knew where he was. He was in prison. He had no ability to access me. Before I changed my phone number, he was trying to reach out to me, but I just knew like I don't want to deal with this anymore, so I'm completely removing myself from him. But there was definitely a sense of safety of like there's no way that he's ever going to find me, right? Like I moved across the country. He has no idea where I'm at. Now that he's out, I definitely had those feelings of, oh my God, what if? But though I was able to move past those feelings and I'm no longer worried about the past anymore. I've closed that chapter of my life. But for me, especially if someone who's also struggling with like wanting to talk about it, but they do have those fears, I'm standing in my truth. Me and him know exactly what happened. And I'm going to speak my truth because that is my lived experience. You cannot take that away from me. You may not like it, but that is what you decided to do. And I'm going to put it in people's faces because I know it's the truth. I've never mentioned his name. You have no idea what he looks like unless you Google him, and you'll be able to see that this is a repeated pattern of his. But what you did is what you did, and I'm standing in my truth. And that's how I'm taking my power back. I don't give a fuck how it makes you feel, and a lot of people don't have that type of mentality, but I've been able to grow and just know that this is my lived experience and I'm not ashamed about it. Yes, it sucks. I could have gone without that trauma. I really could have not dealt with going through that, but I'm so fucking thankful for it now because look at who I am today. You no longer have that power over me. You no longer have that fear instilled in me. If I was to see him today, it wouldn't even bother me because I'm no longer that broken girl that you met back in 2020. So I don't give a fuck how it makes you feel, honestly. But that it's my truth and I'm going to stand on it.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, I 1000% agree with you. I totally agree that that is your truth and like however he feels, right? Like on both our ends, like that's not our responsibility.
Nope.
I guess I was more so thinking about like the safety part of it, right? Like,
Hmm.
and I know that for you, it's like there's no way that he could ever find you. But I mean, personally, I'm like, I don't know where he is,
Yeah.
but I think he has a good sense of where I am, right?
Hmm.
And that's just because of my situation, right? And like,
Right.
I always think about those things and I'm like, what are your suggestions on women who are kind of worried about their ex finding them, right? Like, what
Yeah.
are some safety procedures that they could take to keep themselves safe?
Yeah. I think because I was definitely having those feelings as well, especially knowing that he was getting out of prison. I remember getting a letter in the mail from the Department of Corrections letting me know that this person is being released in 90 days. And in the beginning, I mean, I was terrified. I'm not going to sugarcoat and, say like, oh, I didn't care. No, I was absolutely terrified. And then all of these thoughts and scenarios started creeping in my head of like, well, what if he's been sitting in prison for 4 years and just ruminating, on the fact that I'm the reason why he's there. And the minute that he gets out, he's going to finish what he started, right? I really started living in this fear that I was creating myself. I was, making up these scenarios that wasn't my reality. And I really had to talk myself off the ledge, if you will, and just be like, you're safe. You're in a completely different state. You have such a strong support system around you. You have these things in place that in case someone does try to come after you, you know how to protect yourself. I definitely went to the shooting range a few times and learned how to use a gun because God forbid if I have to, I know how to protect myself. But I think we need to not live in the what if. And that's what really was able to make me get out of the anxious mindset that I was. This is not my reality. And I think it's important for us to remember that what you're thinking could happen, while it can possibly happen, a lot of the times it's just our fear, or us thinking about something that's not really what it is, and just talking yourself off that ledge and just telling yourself you're safe, you're not the same person that you was when you met him. Telling people, making sure that you do have places to go to in case you do come across that person, making sure that they don't know where that person lives, so you do have some sort of escape plan. But honestly, just knowing that you are stronger than what you think you are. And just because you went through that back then doesn't mean that you're that same person today. And I know I'm not the same person that I was when I met him. And that is able to give me my power back, to be like, you can't manipulate me the way that you did before. You can't scare me the way that you did before. Like, that power I took back into myself, and I'm releasing that from you. And that has helped me heal on my own journey.
Love that. I love that. And, I feel like sometimes women feel like they can't access their anger. And this is something that I work with the women in my practice all the time, right? Like accessing that healthy aggression. And
Hmm.
that healthy aggression is what helps you to take action and to stand up for yourself and to set
Hmm.
that boundary and to say, no, you are not going to bully me. You're not going to take my power. Like I have my power back, right? Like
Yep.
that, all of that, it are all of the things that you just said are really great examples of that healthy aggression. Really.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So, Lianne, you're clearly someone who has created or developed that resiliency in your nervous system. So, I'm curious to know what resiliency means to you. I know that I shared a little bit about what it means to me, but I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on resiliency and how can women begin to create that resiliency?
I think resiliency for me is being able to learn from my past experiences and not repeat what I did in the past. I said in the beginning that I was really someone who was just on the hamster wheel of toxicity and meeting the same type of person in a different body. But my last experience was really the one that made me look in the mirror and take accountability, and not necessarily in what that person did, because I'll never take responsibility for what he did to me, but I will always stand on taking responsibility for what I chose to continue putting up with. So I think resiliency for me is being able to break that cycle and being able to create new patterns, new habits, learning how to fall in love with myself and focus on the relationship that I have with me instead of worrying about getting that from another person. I say all the time on my podcast that the relationship that you have with you really sets the tone for every other relationship that you have in your life. And it's not just the romantic ones, it's how you show up in the world, your career, your family, your friendships, all of that, right? And I think what I've realized on my own journey is I did not have a relationship with myself ever in my life. And it took for me to almost lose myself in order for me to really appreciate and start to fall in love with me. So that's what it looks like for me. And that's what I would really want people to, especially women, stop focusing so much on everyone else and focus on yourself, especially us Latinas. We were raised in homes that, like, we come last. Our moms came last. They worried about everyone else and they had nothing to pour into themselves at the end of the day. But I think this generation now, like, we're able to really shift that narrative and really make it not be that we're being selfish, but we're being self-full. And I will stand on that hill until I can't anymore. I fucking matter. Like, the relationship that I have with myself is number one priority. And then everyone else comes after that. I mean, I'm a single mom too, right? And I have to take care of her. But baby girl, you got to wait. Mom got to be good first. And then you'll come to that. And then I'm teaching her that too. So I think that's what we really need to focus on. Like, just pour into you, love on you, take care of you, and everything else comes second to that.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much. Like, I want to do like snaps to that. Like,
Yes.
yes, that is so good. And I love how you said it's not just about romantic relationships because you can be in toxic and abusive friendships too, or
Yep.
family relationships, right? And it is all a direct reflection of of your relationship with yourself.
Yep.
Once you love yourself, once you can connect with yourself, once you have self trust and self love, you can teach other people how you're going to be treated, right? Like
Yep.
you're not going to be in these relationships that don't love you back.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think for me too, taking the time to not hop into a new relationship immediately after, that's something that I used to do all the time. I've been single, I've been celibate for 3.5 years now because I've been so committed to working on me that I don't want the distractions from anyone else. I know what it's like to repeat that cycle, but I'm choosing to do something differently. And I'm just loving the relationship that I'm having with me now. So I really want to put that out there too. Like, take some time to heal, y'all. Take some time to be in your solitude, to be alone, to get comfortable with being alone, because there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. But I think once you really start to appreciate yourself by yourself, that's how you're able to set those boundaries and have better standards. So when you do decide to go back out there, you're not going to attract the same person that you used to be attracted to, because you now look at yourself of a higher value person. I hate saying that, high value woman. I think that's so cringe, but honestly, like, you're able to really look at yourself in a different light because you took the time that you needed for you. So start with you, y'all.
I love that so
Yes.
much. Thank you so much, Lianne. Thank you for dropping all of these gems and sharing your story with me and with our audience. I know that so many women are going to relate to you and your story, and I really appreciate you being brave and vulnerable with us. And again, just sharing what you've experienced. And I
Yes.
love that you get to be here. I love that you survived this experience to be able to share it with the world.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for having this beautiful platform.
Of course, how can people connect with you and work with you if they want more of you?
Yes. So I'm primarily on Instagram. You can follow me at Watch Us Thrive Podcast. I also offer one-on-one coaching for anyone who's really looking to heal from that toxic and abusive relationship that you've been in. So if you visit my website, WTPodcast.com, I have a little section that says coaching. I have blog posts there, all of my episodes. And also, I have a freebie on there that you can sign up for. It's called the Thrive Guide, 10 steps on how you can heal after trauma. So just visit the link in my bio or in the show notes. And yeah, I'm just here trying to change the world. So
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining me today. If you absolutely loved this episode, I would so appreciate it if you subscribed and left a review on Apple Podcast, or take a screenshot and share this episode on social media. Don't forget to tag me at tatiana.holistic.coach. The more nervous systems we reach, the more generational cycles we break, and the more we contribute to a kinder and safer world. And if you're looking for somatic healing services, send me a DM and I'd love to chat on how I can support you. I'll see you in the next episode.